The summer of 1911 had been, up until that point, completely ordinary. June had come and gone the way June always did in the American Northeast. Warm, sometimes muggy, occasionally interrupted by afternoon showers that cooled the streets just enough to make the evenings pleasant. People went about their lives without worry. The country felt strong. The cities were growing. And on the night of July the 3rd, 5,000 people spread their blankets across the sand at Coney Island and fell asleep beneath the open sky, watched over by a small detail of police officers stationed there to make sure no one stole their shoes while they slept. It was peaceful. It was entirely normal. None of them had any reason to believe that by the time that summer was over, thousands of Americans would be dead. Not from disease, not from war, not from any disaster that left a scar on the landscape, but from heat. To understand what happened in those 11 days in July, you first have to understand the America that existed in 1911. This was a country hurtling toward the future. The automobile was beginning to appear on city streets. The subway had recently opened beneath New York. Factories were running around the clock. Immigration was reshaping every major city along the eastern seaboard, with hundreds of thousands of people arriving from southern and eastern Europe and settling into the industrial corridor that stretched from Pennsylvania all the way up through New England. The country felt modern. It felt prepared. What it was not prepared for in any way was what the sky was about to do. The cities at the center of this story, New York, Boston, Hartford, Providence, were dense in ways that are difficult to imagine today. The buildings were close together, the alleyways narrow, the neighborhoods packed with people living in conditions that the word cramped barely begins to describe. These were not cities designed with comfort in mind. They were designed for production, for commerce, for the relentless processing of human labor. Nothing in their construction had considered what would happen if the air itself became the enemy. By the morning of July the 4th, everything had changed. There are weather events that announce themselves. Hurricanes can be tracked for days before they make landfall. Blizzards gather visibly on the horizon. What happened on the morning of July the 4th, 1911, was something different. It arrived without warning, without spectacle, without any of the visible drama that humans have learned to associate with natural disaster. The temperature simply climbed and kept climbing, and did not stop. What was happening in the atmosphere above the Northeast was the result of a collision of air masses that the science of the time had no way of predicting. An enormous mass of dry, superheated air from the southern Great Plains began to move north into Canada, then curled south and east toward the coast. As it moved, it acted like a wall, cutting off the Atlantic breeze entirely, the way a closed door blocks a draft. The cool ocean air that had always tempered the eastern seaboard summer simply stopped arriving. Millions of people suddenly found themselves, without warning, in conditions more closely resembling the interior of the continent than the coast. The change was so sudden it felt almost violent. In Providence, Rhode Island, the temperature rose 11 degrees in the space of 30 minutes. People who stepped outside in the early morning found an air so thick and heavy it felt like pushing through something solid. And then the records started falling. Boston hit 104 degrees, a temperature it had never recorded before and has not recorded since. In Portland, Maine, it reached 103. In Nashua, New Hampshire, and Bangor, Maine, it hit 106. These were not temperatures these cities had been built to survive. These were not temperatures the people who lived in them had any experience managing. What made the situation uniquely catastrophic was not just the heat, but the combination of forces at work. The dry air from the plains had brought scorching temperatures, the coastal geography layered on top of that, the heavy, clinging humidity that makes 90 degrees feel like something far worse. And then the nights brought no relief. Normally, even a hot summer day in the Northeast yields to a cooler evening. But with the mass of hot air sitting like a lid over the entire region, the temperature barely dropped after sunset. People went to bed in rooms nearly as hot as they had been at midday and woke up. Those who woke up at all into another day already climbing. The physical world showed the strain almost immediately. Rail lines across New England buckled as the steel expanded, bending out of alignment and in some cases twisting completely off their beds. Mail delivery was suspended across the region. Boats in Providence Harbor began to take on water as the pitch that sealed their hulls softened and oozed. Tar on city streets bubbled and ran like dark syrup. A farmer in Woodbury, New York, abandoned his fields when the heat reached high enough to melt candle wax left near his windows. The physical world was communicating something clearly. The problem was that most people had nowhere to go. The meteorologists of 1911 had no tools capable of forecasting what was coming. There were no satellite images, no upper atmosphere readings, no computer models tracking the movement of air masses days in advance. The Weather Bureau could tell you what the temperature was. It could not tell you what it was about to become. And so the heat arrived the way the most dangerous things always arrive, quietly and without announcement, and all at once. To understand why the heat killed the people it killed, you have to spend some time inside the world those people were living in before any of this happened, because the disaster was not simply a matter of temperature. It was a matter of what those temperatures meant when they arrived. In 1911, 2 out of every 3 New Yorkers lived in a tenement. These were buildings constructed quickly and cheaply, sometimes 5 or 6 stories tall, occupying nearly every square foot of their lots, leaving almost no space for air to circulate. Interior rooms had no windows at all, dark, airless chambers where the only ventilation came from a shared hallway. Families of 8, 10, 12 people crowded into 2 or 3 rooms. The buildings retained heat the way stone retains heat, slowly absorbing it through the day and releasing it through the night, meaning the indoor temperature could stay dangerously high long after the sun had gone down. The people who lived in these buildings were, for the most part, recent immigrants, Italian, Jewish, Polish, Irish men and women who had come to America for work and found it in the factories, the docks, the garment districts, the construction sites of the booming northeastern cities. They had very little margin. They could not afford to stop working. They could not afford to leave the city for the country the way wealthier families did each summer. They were locked by economics and circumstance into the most heat-vulnerable environments imaginable. There was nothing available to them by way of technological relief. Air conditioning had been invented in 1902, but existed almost exclusively in industrial facilities. It was not in homes, hospitals, or the settlement houses where the urban poor sought help. Electric fans were expensive enough to be a luxury, and in any case, a fan moving hot air around a sealed room provided only the illusion of comfort. In 1911, 2 out of every 3 New Yorkers lived in a tenement. These were buildings constructed quickly and cheaply, sometimes 5 or 6 stories tall, occupying nearly every square foot of their lots, leaving almost no space for air to circulate. Interior rooms had no windows at all, dark, airless chambers where the only ventilation came from a shared hallway. Families of 8, 10, 12 people crowded into 2 or 3 rooms. The buildings retained heat the way stone retains heat, slowly absorbing it through the day and releasing it through the night, meaning the indoor temperature could stay dangerously high long after the sun had gone down. And then there were the horses. It is easy to forget that the city of 1911 ran on horses. They pulled the delivery wagons, the ambulances, the fire equipment, the trolleys in some neighborhoods, the carts that brought ice and food and goods to the tenements of the Lower East Side. There were hundreds of thousands of them in the major northeastern cities, and they were, it turned out, just as vulnerable to the heat as the people who depended on them. The horse was not a small detail in this story. It was a structural element of urban civilization, and what happened to them that July was a signal of how completely the heat was capable of dismantling the systems that held city life together. None of this vulnerability was visible as a problem until the heat arrived and lit it up. The city looked functional. It looked modern. It looked from a certain angle, like a place that had everything under control. What it had in reality was a population with almost no ability to protect itself from what the atmosphere was about to do. The morning of July the 4th began with people gathering in the streets to watch the thermometers. There was something almost disbelieving in this. Crowds standing around the outdoor temperature gauges near city halls and newspaper offices, watching the mercury climb as the sun rose, as if witnessing it collectively might somehow make it less real. By mid-morning, the heat was already unlike anything most of them had experienced. By the afternoon, the first people were dying. The deaths in those early hours were the expected ones: the very old, the very young, the already sick. An elderly man collapsed on a sidewalk in Lower Manhattan. An infant in Boston failed to wake from an afternoon nap. These deaths were terrible, but they registered at first as isolated incidents. What no one yet understood was that this was not a single hot day. The heat was not going to break overnight. The morning of July the 5th arrived with temperatures already high before the sun was fully up, and it was then that the realization began to settle across the region. This was something different. This was not going to end. By the 5th, industry had come to a standstill. Factories shut down because workers were passing out at their stations. Courts adjourned. Stores shuttered early. The city of New York, which prided itself on its ceaseless energy, its round-the-clock commerce, its refusal to slow down for anything, had slowed down. and the people who lived in the tenements began to migrate outward, away from the lethal interiors of their apartments, into any space that promised even a degree of relief. The parks filled first. Central Park, Battery Park. Every patch of grass in every neighborhood became an improvised camp, covered with families who had dragged blankets and mattresses outside because staying indoors was simply not survivable. In Boston, the Common was described by one newspaper as the biggest boarding house in New England, with 5,000 men, women, and children lying on the ground every night, trying to sleep in the open air. The sidewalks of tenement neighborhoods were lined with bodies stretched out on bedding, entire families sleeping in the street rather than return to rooms that had never cooled. People rode streetcars and ferries in circles, not to go anywhere, just to feel the slight movement of air against their skin. The destinations did not matter, the motion did. The nights were the worst of it. The expectation, the desperate hope, was that after dark the temperature would drop enough to make sleep possible. It did not. The brick and stone and asphalt of the cities held the heat they had absorbed through the day and radiated it back through the night. The interior of a tenement room after a full day of sun could reach temperatures that would not be safe to keep food in, let alone sleep in. People took to the rooftops. They climbed up to the highest points of their buildings and lay down on the tar paper and gravel surfaces, 6 stories above the street, hoping for a breath of cooler air. But rooftops were dangerous in ways the street was not. People rolled in their sleep, rolled through guardrails, fell. There were reports across the region of men and women and children found dead or broken on the sidewalks below buildings where they had climbed up to sleep. A 28-year-old Italian immigrant named John Merlo rolled in his sleep on the tin roof of his boarding house in Hartford and crashed through a low guardrail, falling to the concrete below. He had done nothing wrong. He had simply tried to find a way to survive the night. 75 seamstresses collapsed in a single Manhattan garment factory in one afternoon. A teamster fainted from his wagon seat and was trampled by the horses he had been driving. Workers digging the foundations of new buildings fell where they stood. Women picking blueberries in the fields outside the cities collapsed in the rows. The heat was taking people in the middle of ordinary acts, ordinary moments, giving no warning and making no distinctions. The smell of the city changed. Horses were dying in the streets, more than 600 of them in New York City alone, collapsing in their harnesses on the cobblestones, and there were so many that the city could not remove them fast enough. They lay where they fell, at the sides of roads and in the middle of intersections, in heat that accelerated everything nature does to the dead. The smell settled over the neighborhoods like a second disaster layered on top of the first. Combined with the tar bubbling on the pavement and the garbage rotting in the alleyways, the air itself had become something you had to push through. The city's ability to move, to deliver food, to transport the sick, to carry the materials of daily life was visibly breaking down, and people were watching it happen with a particular kind of dread, the dread of understanding that the systems meant to hold everything together were not going to hold. The psychological dimension of what was happening began to surface in newspaper reports from across the region, and it was disturbing in a very particular way. The heat was not just killing people, it was destabilizing them. In every major city affected by the wave, journalists and police officers reported encounters with people who had been, in the language of the time, driven out of their minds by the heat. The New York Tribune reported that a man described as partly crazed by the heat had run into the street and attacked a police officer with a meat cleaver. In Harlem, a laborer attempted to throw himself in front of a moving train and had to be physically restrained by officers who wrestled him into a straitjacket. At the end of Pike Street in Lower Manhattan, a young man who had spent hours trying to find a shady corner where he could rest walked to the edge of a pier and jumped into the East River. As he jumped, he said clearly, "I cannot stand this any longer." In Boston, an elderly man named Jacob Segar sat in his rented room and shot himself. He left no note that history has preserved. He did not need to. This was what happens to a human nervous system when it has been subjected for days without relief to temperatures it was not designed to endure. And yet people showed one another extraordinary acts of care. In Hartford, a local family donated barrels of water to the parks so that people sleeping there through the night would have something to drink. Neighbors carried the unconscious to the shade. Police officers became something closer to emergency medical workers, moving through overcrowded parks and streets, watching for people who had gone still in ways that were no longer the stillness of sleep. Ordinary people trying to survive something they did not understand and had not asked for, reached for one another. On July the 9th, a line of thunderstorms swept through the region, and the temperature dropped sharply. People poured into the streets with something close to celebration, but the relief lasted only 2 days. On July the 11th, the heat returned, not as extreme as the first wave, but after the brief respite it felt almost worse, because now people knew that even a thunderstorm was not an ending. The exhaustion that had been building for a week had nowhere to go. On July the 11th, at 3:30 in the morning, the Federal Express, a passenger train running from Washington to Boston, derailed near the station in Bridgeport, Connecticut, after its crew, running late, attempted to make up time through a restricted speed zone. The engine and 6 cars tumbled 20 feet down an embankment to the street below, killing 14 people and injuring dozens more. Among the passengers who survived, sleeping in a Pullman car at the rear of the train, was the entire roster of the St. Louis Cardinals baseball team on their way to Boston for a series against the Braves. There was no protocol, no emergency framework, no designated chain of authority for managing extreme heat as a public health crisis because no one in American government had ever classified heat that way. It was weather, it was uncomfortable, it was, in the minds of those responsible for making decisions, something that people managed on their own. The result was that the institutional response when it came late and haphazardly. New York's Mayor William Gaynor did not convene an emergency meeting until the heat wave was already days old, and the city's newspapers were filling with death counts. When he did act, his most consequential decision was his most direct one. He authorized emergency ice shipments from suppliers across the country and opened the city's budget to distribute it free of charge in working-class neighborhoods, prioritizing blocks where children and the elderly were most concentrated. Large blocks of ice appeared at street corners across Lower Manhattan and the immigrant neighborhoods of the Lower East Side. Children gathered around them, licking the ice, pressing their faces against it. It was not a sophisticated intervention, but it was the right one, and it came because a mayor looked at what was happening to his city and decided that the normal rules of who gets what in America needed, at least for the duration of the emergency, to bend. What the ice distribution revealed, almost uncomfortably clearly, was the ordinary geography of the crisis. Ice had always been a luxury commodity in American cities. It was produced in industrial facilities, stored in warehouses, and sold at prices that placed it firmly in the category of things that middle-class and wealthy households received as a daily delivery and working-class households did not. When the city began placing it on street corners for free, people who had never had regular access to it crowded around the distribution points, sometimes jostling, sometimes in tears. The commodity being offered as emergency relief had been available all along. It had simply never been directed toward the people who needed it most. Other cities improvised what they could. Hartford made ferry and trolley rides free so that people who had been riding in circles on their own could do so without spending money they did not have. Fire hydrants were flushed and left running in the streets, offering children somewhere to play in the spray and cooling the pavement slightly. Parks and beaches were officially opened for overnight sleeping, a significant act in an era when sleeping in public was generally illegal and regularly enforced. The New York City Health Department issued one of the first formal heat advisories in American history, urging residents to stay out of direct sunlight and to remain outdoors as much as possible. The advice was well-intentioned, its limitations were stark. Telling a family in a windowless tenement room to stay out of the sun does not address the fact that their building has been storing heat since dawn. Telling people to go outside does not change the fact that outside, the thermometer was still reading numbers no one in the region had ever seen. The police forces of the major cities became by default the primary responders on the ground. Officers who normally walked their beats enforcing ordinances found themselves instead carrying unconscious people to shaded areas, organizing water distribution, and making rapid assessments about who was still breathing. It was not a role they had been trained for, but it was the role the emergency gave them because the emergency arrived fast. The counting of the dead began as the heat subsided, and what it revealed was both staggering and predictable. The confirmed numbers were themselves severe in New York alone. Over 200 people were officially attributed to the heat, with Philadelphia and Boston recording comparable figures. But the confirmed numbers were almost certainly a significant undercount. Deaths caused or accelerated by the extreme temperatures were often recorded simply as heart failure or respiratory collapse, with no notation of the conditions in which they occurred. more than 200 people across the region drowned jumping into rivers and ponds to escape the heat, and these were typically recorded as drownings, not heat deaths. When historians have attempted to reconstruct the full toll, the estimates range from 2,000 to as many as 6,000 deaths from Pennsylvania to Maine. The dead were not evenly distributed. They were concentrated, overwhelmingly, in the people who had always been concentrated in the most vulnerable conditions, the recent immigrants in the tenements, the elderly people living alone, the infants whose bodies could not regulate temperature in airless rooms, the workers who had been outside all day in the heat because stopping meant losing wages they could not afford to lose. The heat wave did not create the inequality that shaped its death toll. The inequality was already there. The heat wave simply made it, for 11 days, impossible to ignore. When the heat finally broke in mid-July of 1911, it left no wreckage. This is one of the strangest and most significant things about it. A hurricane tears apart buildings and fills the streets with debris. A flood leaves a waterline on the walls and silt on the floors. A fire leaves ash. Heat leaves nothing, at least nothing you can point to or photograph or stand inside and comprehend. The temperature dropped, the air returned to normal. The people who had survived went back inside their apartments and their factories and their ordinary lives, and within days the city had resumed its familiar pace, and the streets looked exactly as they had always looked. The disaster had happened entirely inside the bodies of the people it had touched, and the grief of the families it had left behind, and grief does not leave a visible mark on a city. This invisibility was both a feature of heat waves and their most dangerous quality. Disasters that leave no visible mark are disasters that are very easy to forget, and the summer of 1911 was, in the years and decades that followed, largely forgotten. It did not enter the popular memory the way the great fires and storms of American history had. It did not generate the lasting cultural reckoning that a disaster of its scale deserved. It was absorbed and then allowed to recede. What it did leave behind, embedded in the institutions forced to respond to it, were small but meaningful shifts. The formal heat advisory that the New York City Health Department had issued during that July was one of the first of its kind anywhere in the country, establishing the idea, tentative and incomplete as it still was, that extreme heat was something a public health authority had a responsibility to address. The conversations about housing reform that had been building in American cities for years were sharpened by the evidence that tenement design was not merely a question of social justice, but of survival. Documents emerged from the medical community attempting to categorize and understand heat-related illness in ways that had not been systematically attempted before. These were quiet consequences, bureaucratic and institutional, nothing like the physical transformation a flood or earthquake leaves behind, but they were real. What did not change was the fundamental vulnerability of the people who had suffered most. The tenements were still there. The poverty that concentrated people in them was still there. The gap between what the city offered the comfortable and what it offered the poor persisted without significant interruption. The heat wave had illuminated that gap with terrible clarity for that brief, brutal summer, and then the temperature dropped, and the illumination went with it. The systems that had allowed thousands of people to die returned to their ordinary operation, and the people inside those systems returned to their ordinary lives. Harvard epidemiologists who studied the 1911 heat wave a century later noted something striking. The patterns they found: who died, where they died, what conditions made them vulnerable, what interventions came too late, were patterns that would recur in almost every major heat disaster that followed. The 2003 European heat wave that killed more than 70,000 people across the continent, in countries with sophisticated public health systems, because no one had built those systems around the possibility that the air itself could become lethal. The lesson the summer of 1911 tried to teach, and that kept having to be relearned, was that extreme heat is not simply bad weather. It is a public health emergency. It is a social emergency. It follows the lines of inequality with precision. It kills the people a society has already placed in the most precarious positions, quietly and invisibly, in rooms where no one else is watching, leaving nothing behind but absence. The people who die in heat waves do not make noise when they go. There are no explosions, no collapses, no flames to photograph. There is only the next morning, someone who does not wake up. Think back to that beach at Coney Island, the night of July the 3rd, 5,000 people asleep on the sand, unaware, at peace, surrounded by the ordinary sounds of a summer city settling into rest. They were not poor decisions made by careless people. They were ordinary human beings living inside systems that had never been designed with their survival in mind, in a country that had never been asked to protect them from the sky. Within days, thousands of them and their neighbors would be dead, not from an act of war, not from an epidemic, from the temperature of the air in the most powerful nation on Earth in the middle of an ordinary July. That is what the summer of 1911 was. Not a story about the weather. A story about what the weather was allowed to reveal and what was allowed, when the temperature finally dropped, to be quietly forgotten.